Clarice, a maid in Charleston, 1932, who would one day feed the Holloways a meal laced with their own daughter. She was born beneath the high white pillars of the Holloway estate, not as a guest but as a shadow. Her hands were trained to smooth linens until no crease dared show, her voice taught to soften into yes ma'ams and quiet nods. To the family, she was furniture moving, breathing, but never truly seen. Yet within her silence lived a storm. Her story stretched back generations, tied by chains invisible but unbroken. Her great-grandmother Molly had once been written into a ledger at 16 years old, catalogued like an object, suitable for domestic duties. Clarice's grandmother Esther scrubbed the same wooden floors, carrying memories of whips and locked doors. Each woman before her wore the same role obedience polished into habit, endurance stitched into every gesture. Clarice inherited not only their duties but their buried grief, their whispers, their unspent rage, and so she walked the halls as if rehearsing a role, head bowed, smile faint, every movement precise. She dusted the chandeliers, polished silverware, folded linens sharp as blades. To the Holloways, she was invisible perfection, but to herself, she was a ledger, collecting each cruelty and balancing each slight with patience. Every insult, every careless command added weight to the storm behind her eyes. And though the Holloways never noticed, Clarice was waiting, not for a day off, not for kindness, but for the moment when silence would finally serve its purpose. One day, she would not fold sheets or polish spoons. She would prepare a feast, and at that table, the Holloways would consume their own legacy. Never knowing whose hands had written their ending, she moved through the Holloway estate, a place that gleamed with white pillars and polished chandeliers, a mansion dressed in dignity but rotting underneath. To visitors, it was grandeur. To Clarice, it was a cage. Every corner hummed with the echoes of its past, whence the crack of whips, now the sting of sharp words, both leaving the same wounds in different ways. The estate wore its hypocrisy like a crown. Mr. Holloway carried himself as though the very soil bent for him, his aloofness cutting as cold as marble floors. Mrs. Holloway filled the air with venom, her words dripping with the kind of cruelty only privilege can afford. But it was Margaret, their daughter, who twisted entitlement into an art. She wielded her arrogance like a blade, each insult delivered with precision, each humiliation sharpened until it drew invisible blood. Clarice became the silent witness to it all. She poured wine into glasses she could never lift to her own lips. She folded napkins for feasts she would never taste. She listened to laughter rise around tables heavy with roasted meats, sugared pies, and golden plates, laughter fueled not by joy but by gluttony. Every bite the Holloways took seemed to mock her hunger, every toast a reminder of their belief that cruelty was their birthright. The walls themselves seemed complicit, holding the secrets of generations, echoing with arrogance and entitlement. To the Holloways, this estate was legacy, proof of power. To Clarice, it was chains dressed in silk, and though she bowed her head, her eyes saw everything, storing each cruelty like kindling, waiting for the fire that would one day consume it all. But long before that night of reckoning, she was shaped by the chains of her bloodline. Her mother, Esther, raised her with two instructions that could never be broken: serve without flaw, and remember without mercy. The memory stretched back to Molly, a girl of 16 once catalogued as suitable for domestic duties. Molly's silence became the seed, passed down to daughters who scrubbed, folded, and bowed while the world mistook obedience for emptiness. Esther carried that memory like iron shackles hidden beneath her skin, and she pressed it into Clarice's hands as carefully as folded linens. Esther did not soften history with pity. She spoke of ancestors not with trembling voices but with steady ones, demanding that Clarice hold their pain like a burden meant never to be dropped. "Do not cry for them," her silence seemed to say. "Carry them," and Clarice did. She learned to scrub floors until they gleamed, to step lightly so her presence vanished, to smile politely as venom dripped from the mouths she served. She became invisible not out of weakness, but out of training. Every insult she overheard was tucked away like a mark in a ledger. Each cruelty etched itself into her memory, stacking one atop another, a silent book no one else could read. Her calm face was her mask, her quiet steps her shield. But beneath that stillness, something grew. Not sudden rage, not madness, but inherited centuries of endurance pressed into her spine. Vengeance, in her, was not a spark. It was a slow fire, passed down from mothers who whispered in the dark, waiting for the day it would finally burn. The turning point came not from years of silent wounds, but from one girl's cruelty. Margaret Holloway, only 19, was the sharpest blade in that household of venom. Where her parents wounded with words, Margaret chose humiliation as her favorite weapon. She spat on polished floors, daring Clarice to crawl with rags to erase the insult. She tipped over trays, laughing as silverware scattered and food spoiled, never once thinking of the hands that had prepared it. Sometimes, when no one else was near, she struck Clarice across the face, quick, sharp, and hidden like a family secret. Every act was a performance of power, a reminder that to Margaret, cruelty was her birthright. But there was one moment when the mask of patience slipped. During a grand feast, a ham glazed in sugar and cloves was carried out, the centerpiece of the table. Margaret, with a smirk, shoved it aside, sending it crashing onto the polished wood. The juices bled across the grain, dripping like mockery onto the floor. She looked at Clarice, eyes narrowed, and spat the words, "Swamp rats shouldn't cook fine food." Clarice knelt, rag in hand, wiping slowly, the scent of ruined meat rising like smoke. In that moment, silence broke not outwardly, not with words, but within. She knew Margaret had written her own name in the ledger Clarice had carried for years. That night, as the estate quieted, Clarice's decision hardened like iron. This was not rage. This was not a fleeting spark. It was resolution, sharpened and irreversible. Vengeance would be served at the same table where Margaret had once laughed. Invisibility was her shield, and invisibility was her sword. While the Holloways walked past her without a glance, she studied them. Every sneer, every careless bite of food, every moment of arrogance. Clarice recorded it all with the patience of someone who knew that time itself was on her side. In the kitchen, she rehearsed. At first, no one noticed the changes. A pinch more bitterness in the broth, a faint metallic edge in the stew, bone shavings ground so fine they disappeared into gravy. Drops of her own blood stirred into pots as she whispered the names of those who had come before Hermile. Esther, the nameless women catalogued only as property. The Holloways never paused. They tasted only richness, believing indulgence was their birthright. Margaret grew bold, taunting more loudly, demanding more from her meals. Clarice, in turn, grew quieter, more patient. Down in the dim cellar, where shadows clung to the walls, she prepared more than food. she prepared destiny. Each iron pot sat heavy with intent. Each spice jar became a silent accomplice. The air thickened with more than steam, it carried the weight of vengeance ripening. Slowly, invisibly, the Holloway's gluttony was her greatest disguise. They were blinded by their appetite, deaf to the warnings that trembled in the air. Their plates came full, their cups refilled, and not once did suspicion cross their minds. Clarice knew the truth with a certainty that burned steady. Whatever she placed before them, they would consume. And in that blind trust of their own hunger, she found the key. Their downfall would not need force, it would come from the very act they cherished most. Beneath a chandelier, once raised above slave auctions, its glow cold and merciless, the Holloways gathered. They sat in comfort, unaware that the meal before them carried the weight of centuries. The stew simmered thick and fragrant. The meat glistened, tender, sliding from bone with effortless ease. Each spoonful rose to their lips with mindless hunger. They praised Clarice, their voices casual, their laughter untroubled. They tasted richness, but never suspicion. They devoured, blind to the truth that Margaret Holloway herself had become the feast. Every bite was ritual, crafted in silence. Clarice did not tremble. Her hands moved with grace, pouring wine, steady and unbroken. She cleared the plates, polished the silver, her gaze lingering as they consumed their own bloodline. In that dining room, the ordinary rhythm of supper became an unspoken curse. No screams filled the air. No violent eruption shattered the moment. Only forks against porcelain, steady as a drumbeat, carried through the chamber. The Holloways, intoxicated by indulgence, never saw what passed between the kitchen and the table. Clarice's vengeance was not fire, nor blade, but silence. Silence heavy enough to bury a dynasty. Each swallow bound them tighter to the fate she prepared. What for them was gluttony, for her was ceremony. Every flavor masked a history too long ignored. Every sip of wine washed down generations of cruelty. They thought themselves masters of the house. That night, they were merely participants in their own undoing. The feast ended without incident, yet everything had already changed. History had been consumed, swallowed whole, disguised as supper, and Clarice alone stood knowing its true taste. Clarice Holloway, the kitchen slave of Georgia, who fed her master's family a supper of vengeance, now sat within walls that seemed to awaken against their keepers. The Holloway estate, proud and towering, began to turn upon itself. What started as a faint odor drifted through the air, delicate as smoke, soon thickened until it clung to every surface. From the walls, the cellar, the hearth, a suffocating stench rose. As though the house exhaled its buried past, Clarice sat silently by the fire, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She whispered the names of her ancestors into the flames, each syllable carried upward in the hiss of ash. The fire whispered back, a low murmur that only she seemed to hear. It was no longer just a hearth, had become an altar. Guests who gathered for Holloway dinners noticed what the family ignored. They sat at the grand table, their faces pale, their appetites ruined by something they could neither taste nor name. They left unsettled, whispering about shadows that clung to long-end flavors that soured on the tongue. Yet the Holloways themselves continued to gorge, unable to resist the very feasts that deepened their undoing. Around them, the house faltered. Mirrors refused to reflect light, their glass dimmed to a sullen darkness. Chandeliers, once brilliant, flickered and dulled, as though suffocating in their own brilliance. Footsteps echoed wrong, stretching too far, as if the floors carried voices of the dead. The estate groaned like a body straining under its own weight. Clarice never raised her voice. She never lifted her hand. The house itself bore her vengeance. It breathed with bones buried long before, carrying the justice demanded by generations denied their rest. By the time the feast reached its darkest turn, the family was no longer dining. They were devouring. What began as indulgence had become something grotesque, a compulsion that stripped away every shred of dignity. Mr. Holloway, once so proud in his posture, leaned forward with sweat dripping down his brow, grunting as he tore into the food like an animal. The polished silver in his hand clattered against the plate, forgotten in his frenzy. Across from him, Mrs. Holloway wept as she ate. Each bite trembled with revulsion, yet her fork kept rising, as though her craving outweighed her shame. This was no supper. This was hunger made monstrous. Their table, once a stage of wealth and refinement, had become an altar to greed. The chandelier above cast its light on faces twisted beyond recognition, grotesque statues of gluttony. Bound not by chains, but by appetite around them, guests shifted uncomfortably. Some swore they heard whispers, Margaret's name echoing between each bite, as if the air itself carried the weight of her absence. Every swallow felt haunted. Every glance carried suspicion, and through it all stood Clarice, still as a shadow, her hands folded neatly before her apron. She was the silent conductor of their downfall, orchestrating every bite with the patience of generations. By the time the platters lay bare, there was nothing left, no meat, no grandeur, no illusion of power. Only their own desperation remained. The Holloways were not undone by rebellion or fire, but by appetite itself. They had devoured everything, including the legacy they once believed untouchable. The estate fell silent after that dreadful night, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the very walls. Mr. Holloway was discovered slumped in his grand chair, his mouth grotesquely packed with raw meat, his stiffened hands still clutching at bones, as if even death could not loosen his hunger. Mrs. Holloway was never seen again. Some whispered she had wandered into the basement, swallowed whole by the shadows beneath the house. Others claimed her spirit had seeped into the walls themselves, dissolving into plaster and wood, watching anyone who dared to enter. Whatever the truth, her absence became part of the legend, a question with no answer, a door forever closed. The townsfolk avoided the Holloway estate from that day forward. Its windows shattered one by one, black hollows that stared out across the land. Chandeliers once blazing with light hung dim, swaying gently as though stirred by an unseen hand. Each cracked pane and peeling wall carried the weight of a family's collapse, a lineage consumed by its own cruelty and greed, and Clarice was never seen leaving. Her vengeance lingered like smoke after a fire, woven into the estate's fabric, stitched into the timbers and stones. To step inside was to feel her presence, patient and watchful, as though the house itself had become her voice. What once stood as a proud symbol of southern wealth and pride became a tomb of appetite. The Holloways had built their empire on the backs of others, and in the end, it was their own hunger that swallowed them whole. The house still stands, rotting in silence, its windows black, its chandeliers swaying though no wind passes through. Locals call it the house that tastes of ash. Some swear they see Clarice's figure at the parlor window, humming low lullabies. Others say the smell of roasted meat drifts from the kitchen where no fire burns. The Holloways believed their cruelty was their birthright, but at their own table they consumed it. Brick by brick, bone by bone, their name dissolved into whispers. The estate did not fall to riot or flame, it collapsed from within, feasting on itself. And that is the truest horror. Cruelty never disappears. It lingers in walls, in dust, in stories carried forward so they cannot be erased. If you pass through Charleston, you can still find the ruins. But if you dare to look inside, remember, Clarice is waiting. This was just one act of vengeance carved into America's shadowed past. And there are more. Stories buried, stories silenced, stories that demand to be told. So stay with us. Subscribe, because the next story may chill you even deeper and remind you that history never truly dies.